It's time for Supply Chain Now. Broadcasting live from the supply chain capital of the country, Atlanta, Georgia. Heard around the world, Supply Chain Now spotlights the best in all things supply chain. The people, the technologies, the best practices, and the critical issues of the day. And now, here are your hosts.
Hey, good afternoon. Scott Luton and Greg White with you here on Supply Chain Now. Welcome to today's show. Greg, good afternoon. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm pretty excited about this. We don't get to talk about S&OP much.
Well, we have got a very special show with two supply chain gurus, especially when it comes to S&OP and forecasting and planning. So our listeners are in for a treat. More to come on that in just a moment. But Greg, as always, we encourage folks, if they enjoyed today's conversation, find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcast from.
That's a great idea, Scott.
Hey, you don't want to miss a thing, especially with conversations like this with a white hot topic in global supply chain. So with no further ado, let's formally introduce our two featured guests today. Anthony Zempello, consultant, educator, Apex master instructor. Z, how are you doing?
I'm doing great today.
It is so great to have you here. It's been a year and a half, 2 years since you and I last rubbed elbows. But love the work you're doing in the space, and we're going to talk more about that here momentarily. And our dear friend, Fred Tolbert, principal with Southeast Demand Solutions and member of the Apex Atlanta Hall of Fame. And if you're not, Fred, you should be. Fred, how you doing?
Well, hey, I'm doing great. Scott, Greg, hey, good to be with you again.
Yeah, great to have you. Are you a member of the Hall of Fame?
Not sure there is a Hall of Fame. But,
he's a member of our informal Hall of Fame.
Scott is in baseball mode right now, man.
Longevity is a requirement. I definitely have it there.
Well, Fred, last time you were on the show, you were facilitating a great conversation with some of the brightest soon-to-be supply chain practitioners at the University of Georgia. So appreciate what you do to mentor those bright students. But you know what? As Greg and I think both talked about, they could have mentored us on that last episode.
Absolutely.
All right. So, Greg, we're going to dive right into the front end of this conversation. We're going to be able to get to know Z and Fred a little bit better. So for starters, Z, let's start with you. So tell us a little bit, where are you from, and give us something that folks don't know about Anthony Zempello.
Okay, well, I'll keep that on the not so secret side. But I mean, basically, I am an Italian from New Jersey. That's where I was born and bred. So no matter what you guys say, it's all Yankees all the way. That's it.
There you go.
So
they got another great team this year.
All right, so a really important question, Z. Are you Yankees, Giants, Rangers, or Yankees, Jets, Islanders?
Yankees, and then Giants, sometimes Jets, and hockey. I just never got into it all because we had to go outside in the cold on the lakes.
I'm with you.
So that wasn't for me.
I'm with you. All right, so it's all about the Yankees. That's good.
It's all about the Yankees. And then through S&OP, believe it or not, I know Tommy Hotovy, who is the pitching coach for the Cubs now. Took him out to dinner when he was in the minor leagues in Fort Myers. He worked for a client out in Kansas City.
Mm.
So S&OP will touch every part of your life eventually.
Even baseball.
I love it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love it.
So that I started there. I live in Rhode Island, and I've been in Rhode Island for over 40 years, and both my kids were born here. So I'm pretty much a Rhode Islander. But to make any money, I'm traveling somewhere. Anywhere, except, of course, for the last few months, but we won't go there at all. As far as something that's really different that, people won't know, even my family doesn't remember half the time. I left home the first time after 8th grade. I was out of there.
Wow.
So I spent 2.5 years away from home before I came back. And so that's something that not everybody will know.
So
that's like 14, right? Z?
Yeah, exactly.
Wow. Where did you go?
I went away to a high school in Goshen, New York.
Okay.
It was a junior seminary.
Okay.
So I spent 2.5 years there before I figured out, yeah, well, maybe no, this isn't going to be it.
Maybe S&OP instead, right?
Yeah, they didn't have it right back then.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Somebody was thinking about it.
But nevertheless, so you became independent and really grew up before a lot of folks your age. Is that right?
You could say it that way, sure. Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, all right. So now that we've got that out of the way with Z, Fred, same questions to you. Tell us a little bit about where you're from, and just like Z did, give us something that folks don't know about Fred Tolbert.
Well, I am what's a little bit rare in the Atlanta area. I'm a local Georgia boy.
No kidding.
I've heard Greg talk about the town that he grew up in. I grew up in Jefferson, Georgia, which at the time was a very small town, about 1,800 people at the time. I think Atlanta's growing out that way now up towards South Carolina, and I think about 12,000 people now. But I literally grew up in a great small town, a great neighborhood. There probably aren't many people listening that know when I say Beaver Cleaver, but the Leave It to Beaver, I literally grew up on the street like Leave It to Beaver or Dennis the Menace. It was a great neighborhood, a great environment, full of kids. We had a blast growing up in the small town. My parents owned a grocery store, a small town grocery store. So I grew up running the cash register and bagging produce and pumping gas and stocking shelves and doing the payroll. And I learned a lot. I probably learned as much in my business career from working in the grocery store than I did all through the college work that I did.
When did you start working there, Fred?
My dad started the store when I was about 8. And it was a really small store at the time, but there, even to bag the groceries, we stacked up some of the old Coca-Cola crates. So I had something to stand on so I could see up over the counter there to bag the groceries. But literally up until I was out of college, I was working at the store on the weekends. And boy, I got a good education about business watching my mom and dad run that business. Growing up in a small town, maybe had an opportunity to play a lot of sports, and maybe something people would not suggest. I was a reasonably good pole vaulter of all things. So,
wow.
So on the local track team there in school, so pole vaulting was one of my activities that I did.
Wow, interesting.
That is not what I was expecting you to share, Fred.
A pole vaulter on Supply Chain Now?
Might be. No, I actually think we have another one, but I can't place it. But we have, but that is super rare regardless. But you still doing that, Fred?
No, that was a long time ago. Bad knees. Knees don't let you do things like that anymore.
Yeah.
It's only about 3 feet high now, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, so Jefferson, Georgia, for our listeners, is up the 85 corridor, as Fred mentioned, towards South Carolina. And from a supply chain perspective, Jefferson and Pendergrass, that whole area, a lot of distribution centers, fulfillment centers. It's been a really popular area of development as Metro Atlanta, as you put it, Fred, continues to expand out and get everything's in Atlanta before we know it. All right, so Greg, now we kind of want to shift gears from understanding.
I'd just love to hear more about.
Well,
early days. I know we have to.
What's funny, Greg, is between Z and Fred, and both of they talked about really that independence, lessons learned at an early age, and Fred's pole vaulting. I bet there's a lot more that they both could share, but we'll have to save that for the next episode or the book they write, either one. Yeah. But let's talk about their professional journey.
Yeah, let's get to your next stage in life. So I know that Fred, I have to give him this opportunity, but let me ask you, Z, first. So just give us a kind of a quick rundown of your student, post-student, early career days, and kind of what led you to where you are now.
Sure. Well, that's when you start to think about, when you sit back after all these years and say, what are the things I look back on and really made a difference to me now. And it starts with those first 2.5 years in the seminary, in high school, where I learned all about discipline. Believe me, I learned about discipline there, and keeping to a schedule, because everything was down to the minute as far as what time we got up, when we ate, when we did chores, played baseball or whatever. So that kind of started it. And then after I came back home, finished high school, and then I went down to Argentina and Chile right after high school instead of going to college. And I was doing some lay missionary work for the Catholic Church. One of the biggest things I learned there was you really should learn a little bit more about what you're getting into. And when I went down there, I didn't know a word of Spanish. And
Wow.
Now I was only 18, so there was no fear. These days you would never think of something like that
Right.
at, an age after college. But before then, I learned that, hey, sometimes you do get thrown into things, whether by your own choice or someone else's, to really have to survive. You have to dig in and learn quickly and do things. And so that was another part of the formation. Then after that, I went to college. I mostly did it at night. I went to a community college first, and then Seton Hall after that. And then for one semester, I had to go days because I couldn't get the courses that I wanted at night. But right from there, I started working. And I worked in manufacturing for 30 years, for a precious metals company for 10 years, for a Hasbro toy company for 10 years, and then a bunch of other companies in different industries. And one of the things that has made me understand is that even though you go into a different industry, there's questions that you ask that the people in the middle of it just don't think about because they're experts in their industry. So those kind of things really help you out. And then on those, I started in the accounting department, and then I got quickly involved in inventory control. Then it became inventory management. Then it became production control. Then it became materials management, and it just kept moving. And at three of the companies I was at, I was actually on that end of what is this thing called S&OP, and we're going to put it in here. And I'll tell you right up front, the one I learned the most from was the one that failed the most miserably. And when I look back, I realize all the really deep secrets that I know now that caused that. Part of it is all about the culture and all about dealing with people. It wasn't the technology or anything else at that point. It was all about, well, how do we get this thing done? And we'll talk a little bit later about how do you get people involved and get them on your side. But those are the kind of things that really got me to be more open and have the experience to go in and help other companies when they need it.
So I got to ask you, you started really, really early with big moves, 14. So it's probably hard to select, but maybe just the first kind of epiphanal or aha moment that comes to mind. Anything that kind of really changed your point of view on the world?
From my own business point of view was when I was in accounting, and I realized one day I am constantly going in to talk to people in our manufacturing plants, and I'm asking them about things that might have happened a year ago. We're trying to reconcile the inventory. The numbers aren't right. Hey, do you remember this receipt? And it's like 11, 12 months ago. And I sat there and I finally said to myself, I want to be on the other end. I want to be on the end that's making the things happen, not figuring out later and asking people what happened. And that moved me out of accounting, factory accounting, right into, I want to be a planner. I want to be able to help predict what the future is going to be. I just thought there was a whole lot more fun, if nothing else, in that side of the business.
That's a really interesting shift from analyzing the past to predicting the future. I mean, that's not an insignificant shift. So, all right, Fred, tell us about, I know there's probably a particular school that you want to give a shout out to, but aside from that, tell us about your kind of early career and, any sort of epiphanal moments.
Well, I am a Georgia Bulldog, so I have marketing and finance degrees from UGA. When I got out of school, I worked, started my career in consulting, and over the years, I've switched back and forth from consulting to a practitioner life to software, and I kind of go back and forth at different times. But my early days was at the time Arthur Andersen. It's now Accenture Consulting. So I spent a number of years there at Accenture. Went to work with a client company. We were installing we didn't call it ERP back then. It was just the system. It was a mainframe system, and that is where actually I learned a lot of my inventory management. It's where I got involved with Apex a lot. So I worked with North Highland Company here in Atlanta, which is now a global consulting firm. And I was with North Highland in the early days. And then for the last 23 years, I think, I've been the Southeastern principal with Demand Solutions.
Very cool. All right. So tell me, I'm going to hit you hard on this one. Right. Tell me about something that kind of shifted your worldview or gave you that sort of aha moment. Yeah, something you carry with you.
At Andersen, even in those early days, and when you're a staff guy or a young woman, there was we call it the bullpen. It was just a big room with chairs and desks and all that, and you'd wait around. The partner would come in and assign you to projects, and I got assigned to a project, and it was a purchasing application on an IBM mainframe. And so just by luck of the draw, my first big assignment was working on a purchasing system as a COBOL programmer. I may well have been the worst COBOL programmer that there has ever been. But I served my time as a programmer, but just since then, I've had an interest in inventory management applications and now forecasting and planning and sales and operations planning. Several years later, when I was at Contel Corporation here in Atlanta, and that's when we first bought a PC software system. That was in the early days, the first PCs that people had in their business life. And at the time, it was a forerunner to my company now, Demand Solutions. At the time, it was Focus Forecasting. And the person who developed Focus Forecasting was a fellow named Bernie Smith. And if I have a mentor in my supply chain life, it's Bernie Smith. He's the fellow that came up with the concept of having the system pick the best fit formula as the basis for generating the forecast going forward. Bernie Smith literally wrote the book on that, and we used him as a consultant in my life as the inventory planning manager at Contel. Most of what I still talk about literally 30 years later are things that I learned from Bernie, the performance measures that a company has. And hey, those concepts haven't changed in all this time, but things I learned from Bernie about inventory turns and customer service. I still talk those things. And Bernie and I went to lunch one day, and I said, Bernie, my boss wants me to have a objective of increasing forecast accuracy by 10%. And Bernie said, if your job performance is measured on forecast accuracy, find another job.
I like this Bernie guy.
That's maybe the best advice you've ever gotten right there.
Maybe the best advice, but it tells me, hey, there's a lot of things, and it did teach me things. You can tolerate a lot more forecast error than you may think, but those basic concepts of managing inventory, I learned from Bernie Smith. What a great guy he was. And then I've continued to apply those concepts through the years as I've helped companies to hopefully forecast better and plan better, and to some extent have S&OP processes that has value for them.
Outstanding. Z, you wanted to?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned Bernie, because in the S&OP seminars and workshops, and even with clients, when we get to the step we're talking all about demand, I reference that book itself and Bernie and say, here's a place to go look to start to understand what this thing means. So it's fun. I reference him all the time. I don't remember if I ever met him. I may have at an Apex thing in the Northeast, but
Butler, Pennsylvania is where he's from.
Okay. Yeah, I reference him all the time.
It's interesting. You know, we have talked a lot about forecasting and a lot about how good forecasting can be since COVID, because now people who are not practitioners are very, very curious about it. And that's, exactly, I don't know who said this, and I know that thousands of people have said it since, but basically there is no such thing as a right forecast. It's just a matter of wrong, right? Mm-hmm. How wrong is it? And all of the other aspects, the planning and the resilience and agility aspects of managing your supply chain are really the keys to compensate and account for that forecast error.
There are so many bad supply chain jokes we could get out in this episode. One of the ones that stand out to me at an industry event was what's the difference between Bigfoot and an accurate forecast?
Yeah.
It's folks have claimed to spot Bigfoot previously. No one's claimed to see an accurate forecast. So yeah, I can see my daughters rolling their eyes at my dad jokes right now, but nevertheless. So Greg, we're going to keep driving and setting the table a bit about S&OP, right?
Yeah. So Z, I would love to have you start, this discussion about S&OP. Let's see how deep we can go in the next few minutes, but I'd love to have you start with a definition of what S&OP is, because I understand that yours is the authoritative definition. And then what else have you seen companies call it? Because I know there are at least 2 or 3.
Well, if we started with the Apex definition, I'd have to be reading half this page. That's over there. Half this page. And I'm not going to do that to you guys.
Thank you.
What S&OP really is, it's that translator of translating the business strategy into the action plans. Fred just mentioned before, the planner shouldn't be the one that has to figure out when is COVID going to stop affecting us the way it is now, and we're going to get back. That's got to be up at that business strategy level, and then S&OP is going to be the translator to get it down there. It gets input from all the major departments, and it gets involvement from every department in your company, because now it's going to be a discussion that leads all the way up to a leadership level where you all start with the same facts. Because, all of us know that have worked with any kind of ERP system, if somebody says, what were sales for last month, as many people as there are in the meeting, that's how many different numbers you'll get, and they can all pull it out of the system from somewhere. So S&OP says, okay, here's where we're going to start. Let's not talk about the number. This is the number, right? Wrong, or different. And then you get all that together, and then you start to talk about risk management at a high level into the future, beyond the master scheduling horizon. So that way you can take these plans, put them together, and it's a formal, disciplined, monthly process. And by doing it every month, the biggest advantage you have is if something doesn't come out the way you thought, you're going to meet within a month later to talk about it again. And the first question that I always tell people at every step in the S&OP process, every time you have a meeting, the first question anybody asks is, okay, what do we know now that we did not know last month? And now let's go from there. So it ties all that together and then gives us, into the master scheduling world, a plan that they can convert into, here's what the factory needs to do. Here's what our suppliers need to do to execute this plan.
That's a lot less than 3/4 of a page definition. So I really appreciate that. So either one of you, maybe Fred, either you or Z, what have you heard people call this S&OP process? What other names could it go by that might trigger the psyche of our listeners?
Yeah, well, I think a term as it transitions, in the supply chain world, there's so many acronyms, and I think some people would say that S&OP has evolved into the term IBP, integrated business planning, and maybe that suggests adding a financial concept to what's typically S&OP. We often talk units there, but taking a dollar look at things, and maybe also scenario planning and things, and that may be what has evolved the definition of IBP as the next generation of S&OP.
Mm-hmm.
As far as different names, what I've heard it called, keeping it clean, because I know.
Yeah, right. Because there's been a lot of of profane definitions of it.
I had this parallel path I follow when people ask me the differences. Well, when I was born, way back when, the nurse used to bring the baby to the mother for the first time, and the nurses have all met the kid already. So when nurses brought me to my mother for the very first time, they introduced me as Buster. So for those of you who are around, you'll remember Buster Brown and his dog Tig, and he was a shoe company, and they just named me Buster. Well, S&OP, I equate that to Buster. When it was created, Dick Ling and Walt Goddard came up with the name, let's call it S&OP, Sales and Operations Planning. So then, as when my mother and father got a hold of me, they said, no, his name's not going to be Buster, although that's what they called me for my whole life. His name's going to be Anthony, because that was Grandpa's name on the father's side. This is the Italian thing. So now I became Anthony, and then this name came out, little e S&OP, Executive Sales and Operations Planning. And then along the way, I went to school and I became known as Tony. And then there was this thing called SIOP, PSYOP, which is very popular, especially in aerospace.
Yeah.
That one's out there. So then I was Tony, but then I had kids and they called me Tone because my wife called me Tone. And now I'm into IBP. And then, and this is a far-fetched one, but I refer to myself as Z. It's just so much easier for people to relate to. I worked at a company helping them design and implement S&OP, but we were not allowed to call it S&OP because the CEO had a bad experience. So they called it DNOP, Distribution and Operations Planning, even though they were the manufacturing side of the business. So what I equate it to is I'm the same person I always was, but I had all these different names and at different stages in my life and even for different reasons. And same thing with S&OP. And like Fred says, you know, IBP is becoming more common, but when you really look hard at what the basis of S&OP is, it has all those things. Then it becomes a difference to me of the maturity level. And I think that's kind of like what you're referring to, Fred, is it just keeps maturing, and some people start to call it different things. And some of it is just culture and the way your company runs. So those are just some of the names I've run into.
Yeah, but Z, don't you also see that a lot of people call S&OP, but they're really talking about a detailed master scheduling meeting?
Yeah, all too often we walk in, they say, we have an S&OP process, come help. It's not really, it's really hard and it's not working. And when you look at it, it's a super master schedule. And that's why it's not working, because the amount of detail they're trying to do. And then they still keep focusing on the current as opposed to the future.
So that's a really good point. So how would one, I mean, let's say somebody's caught in that trap. How would one distinguish from a really intense master scheduling process versus S&OP? How do you differentiate that?
Well, when you start to look at the horizons, you know, if you look at a business hierarchy, you've got your strategic plan. That goes out years into the future, very high level, minimal amount of detail, and you validate it with some high level financials. Hey, we think we want to buy another company someday, 3 years from now. We don't even know who they are. Where would we get the money? How much would it cost? What could we do? That gets passed down to S&OP, and now our horizon gets a little bit shorter. Instead of going years out, a typical S&OP horizon, and this will change with every company, we call it 18 months into the future. But the first 3 months of that 18 months is really the master schedule horizon.
Right.
So at the S&OP level, we go from month 4 through 18. The level of detail is now a little bit more defined, but it's in families of products. And we look at our most critical long-term resources. If we have to get a resource that the master scheduler tells us, and whenever they tell us it's already too late, that should be an S&OP resource. So then that first 3 months of this month and the next couple, that's the master schedule. That's where you got to have a ton of detail. If you're make to stock, you're talking about end items. If you're assembled to order, you're talking about the sub-assembly below that end item. If you're assembled to order, if you're make to order, then you're just talking about raw materials at that point because you're waiting to develop the product. So the key there is when you walk into a company that says they're doing S&OP and you sit at a meeting and the first question out of anybody's mouth is, are we going to hit the numbers this month? You know, right there, it's like, whoa, you're in the wrong meeting. That's the master scheduling meeting. And that's happening or should be happening every single week in the company. If you want to know what's going to happen in month 4 through 18, then we're talking S&OP.
To me, it's kind of the difference between planning the shop floor, planning production, planning machine usage inside of a relatively tight time frame, because you have to make that decision at some point, and planning the future, planning the what ifs, right, of the company or the manufacturing facility overall.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to understand when you've seen someone really do it right, when they've crossed that bridge from a series of micro decisions like in a manufacturing planning process to an S&OP process. Tell us about some of the results or some of the kind of breakthroughs that you've seen companies have.
Probably the biggest thing, and again, Fred mentioned this before, is that at the top level of the company, the leadership, that's where you're really talking strategic and taking the worry away from the day-to-day planners and master schedulers about these big events that are happening. You're communicating more through the organization in a more formal way. You're now working together, and we're starting to understand if I'm on the supply side and Fred is on the demand side, you know, if we're not doing S&OP, the only time we're communicating is when we're butting heads, because he's demanding what needs to be done, and I'm sitting there saying, can't do that.
Right.
Give me more time. No, that doesn't make any sense. I worked in a company once, and salespeople would be on me all the time about not hitting stuff. And I would say to them, well, let me talk to the customer. And they say, no, we don't want to do that. But that S&OP starts to take that away. Fred and I are in a meeting, and I'm starting to understand what he's up against. He's starting to understand the kinds of things we need to talk about now to get ready for the future demand that he sees coming or that he's going to create. And then the biggest thing that's coming up a lot more lately is the best companies in S&OP are doing a lot of discussions on risk management. Here's our unconstrained demand plan, and here's what we can do, and here's the gap. Now let's talk about, well, what kind of risk are we taking? Because that demand plan is based on some kind of forecasting, looking at the market further out. And so the first question is, well, we know it's not 100% accurate. Right. How close is it? And then, by the way, the supply side is actually doing forecasting, because every time we put out a production plan going into the future, we're forecasting what we think we're going to make. And guess what? That's not going to happen either. So now we can talk about the risk, and we've got the CEO leading the process. The best companies, the CEO leads the process. And that may mean the division leader or some other title, but the top person leads it. But then you've got your top financial person, you've got your sales people, marketing people, engineering people, supply people, purchasing people. You got all the people that are involved, so that if somebody says one thing, you'll hear what that does to somebody else sitting across from you at the table. And then you can kind of work things out. So the best companies are the ones that really work their way up to that top level and
C-suite input.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And have that really good discussion and then stick with it until next month. And one of the things that it helps with from a company management point of view, it kind of says to leadership, we take this output of your meeting once a month, and then we'd like you to please kind of move out of the way so we can get things done, and then we'll meet again next month. And Greg, it takes the pressure off.
And Greg, and to add on to your question there,
yeah,
there's research that shows that companies that are good at sales and operations planning or integrated business planning, they tend to have better service. They tend to have less inventory on average. They're more profitable, and they will say that their company teamwork is much better than other companies. So, the research shows as hard as it is to do it well, but there are certain real benefits for the companies that do it well.
So Fred, you deploy a lot of this like Z does as well. So aside from the research, is there and I know you probably can't name the company's name. If you can, feel free, but is there a particular case study of someone who really changed how they addressed or changed from not having S&OP to S&OP that you saw where you felt like there was a really material change to the business?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen companies that do it well, and the problem is, boy, they get to a certain point and they have trouble maintaining that momentum, frankly, and sometimes they backslide. But in my world, helping companies as we sell the software, I say you've got to buy the concept before you buy the software. The software doesn't do you any good unless you buy the concept. But
right,
I've got one local Atlanta company that, boy, they were crackerjacks at the sales and operation planning process. They had their demand planning process, and they had a great director of supply chain that was running things for everything. And he told the people, you're getting off your spreadsheets, you're using the system, we're going to use our schedule. And people knew when the S&OP meeting is. And so for a period of time, they were very good at that process. But boy, I will say, there's a lot of people that try it, and not all of them are successful in it, just because of the change that it requires companies to go through.
Well, I think that's really important. One of the things that Z said prior to the show was S&OP is not software. It is a process.
Absolutely.
Right. And you have to commit to the process, whether you use spreadsheets, whether you use technology, or whether you use pen and paper.
Yep.
Or just a good old-fashioned backyard brawl. Either way, you have to commit to the process first.
Yep. But to be able to commit, you've got to get buy-in from the organization at all the levels. And there's been a lot of your answers you've shared kind of speak to that as with the stages of S&OP maturity. But let's talk. Buy-in is so critical to any change, to any discipline of moving the company forward and growing profitably. So let's talk about some best practices around buy-in and buy-in at every level. So Z, why don't you share some of your key takeaways when it comes to buy-in?
Sure. One of the things when you start to talk about buy-in, you've got, like you mentioned, all the different levels. And when you're first thinking about S&OP, first of all, where is this idea coming from? Partner and I went into a company down in Alabama, and they had manufacturing plants around the U.S. And the reason they said, we need this thing called S&OP is because the senior VP of operations would go to the president of that division and say, I need a new plasma cutting machine. Okay, takes a long time to get, costs a whole lot of money, and you really got to make sure it's in and working. You don't just plug and play.
Right.
Or people lose fingers and toes and everything else. And so the president says, well, is it in the budget? And he said, no. If I knew that, then, what I know now, no, I didn't know that. Says, okay, when do you need it? Well, we've been working 7 days a week and we're using the same people, and some of them aren't even coming to work anymore because they made so much money on overtime. So he says, all right, well, I'll fight for you. They got the machine. By time it was in and working, they didn't need it anymore because the business changed a little bit and went in a different direction. So they started looking at, how can I see this coming? And then that's where this whole thing of S&OP came. So the buy-in there was from the fact of getting the president and then getting the financial people to understand that, hey, if we spend our time looking into the future and not just the short term, we've got a better chance of knowing about these things ahead of time and talking about them before we have to make a decision.